Hello there, sleepy friend. Tonight, we'll be talking about how one man's dream led to the discovery of the lost children of the Alleghenies. We post weekly videos, so subscribe to let me sleep for more. Close your eyes and let me take you back to a different time, to the spring of 1856, when the Allegheny Mountains of Pennsylvania were still wild and untamed. This is a true story, one that has been passed down through generations, about two little boys whose disappearance would capture the hearts of an entire community and lead to one of the most mysterious searches in American history. In the remote hollows of Bedford County, Pennsylvania, near the small settlement of Pavia, lived the Cox family. Samuel Cox was a hard-working husband trying to make a life for his family in the rugged mountain country. His wife, Susanna, tended their modest home while caring for their children. Among these children were two little boys who would become forever remembered in the folklore of the Alleghenies. 7-year-old George Cox and his younger brother, 5-year-old Joe. The Cox family lived in what was known as Spruce Hollow, a secluded valley surrounded by dense forests of pine, oak, and birch. It was beautiful country, but it could also be dangerous. The mountains stretched endlessly in all directions, covered with thick underbrush and crossed by countless streams and ravines. It was easy to lose one's way, even for those who knew the land well. The spring of 1856 had been particularly difficult for the Cox family. Food was scarce, and Samuel often had to venture deep into the forest to hunt for game or forage for anything that might feed his family. The long Pennsylvania winter had been harsh, and now that April had arrived, the family was anxious for the warmer weather that would bring new opportunities to gather food and plant crops. On the morning of April 24th, 1856, Samuel Cox was going about his daily routine when he heard his dog barking somewhere in the forest near their home. The sound was persistent and urgent, and Samuel recognized it as the kind of bark his dog made when it had cornered prey. Thinking that the animal must have trapped a squirrel in a tree, Samuel retrieved his rifle and headed into the woods to investigate. The early spring air was crisp and fresh, filled with the sounds of awakening forest life. Samuel expected this to be a quick trip into the woods, just long enough to see what his dog had found, and perhaps bring home some small game for the family table. What Samuel didn't know was that young George and Joseph had seen him leave with his rifle and had decided to follow him into the forest. Perhaps they were curious about what their father was doing, or perhaps they simply wanted to help. Meanwhile, back at the cabin, Susanna Cox was busy with her household chores and assumed that Samuel had taken the boys with him. It wasn't unusual for a father to bring his children along when doing work around the property, and she had no reason to think anything was amiss. The morning passed peacefully as far as she knew, with her husband and sons somewhere nearby. When Samuel returned from investigating his dog's barking, he came back alone. It was only then that the terrible realization dawned on both parents. Samuel had not taken the boys with him, and they were nowhere to be found around the cabin. The children must have followed him into the forest without his knowledge, and now they were missing somewhere in the vast wilderness of the Allegheny Mountains. Initially, they may have thought they could follow their father's trail and catch up with him. The forest floor would have been soft from spring rains, and Samuel's boots would have left clear impressions in the muddy earth. The boys probably followed these tracks, calling out for their father, certain that they would find him around the next bend in the trail. Word spread quickly through the scattered mountain community. By afternoon, a search party had formed. Men, women, and older children spread out in all directions from the Cox cabin, calling the boys' names and listening for any response. The initial search was conducted with the hope that the boys had simply gotten turned around and would be found within a few hours. After all, they were local children who knew something about the woods around their home. Surely they would have the sense to stay in one place if they realized they were lost, or to follow a stream back toward civilization. But as the hours passed and darkness began to fall, that hope began to fade. The searchers built fires and continued their efforts through the night. their torches flickering like fireflies through the dark forest. They called and called, their voices echoing off the mountainsides, but no small voices called back. The next morning, April 25th, brought an even larger search party. News of the missing boys had spread to neighboring communities, and men arrived on horseback and on foot to join the search. The Bedford County Sheriff organized the volunteers into systematic search teams, assigning each group a specific area to cover. These mountain people knew the dangers their forests held. Black bears roamed the Alleghenies, though they were generally shy of humans. More dangerous were the steep ravines and swift-running streams. A small child could easily slip on wet rocks or be swept away by cold mountain water. As the search entered its second day, some began to whisper darker possibilities. Could the boys have been taken by wild animals? Had they fallen into one of the many deep ravines that scarred the mountainsides? Or perhaps they had simply walked so far in the wrong direction that they were now completely beyond the reach of the searchers' voices. The search continued with desperate intensity. Children from neighboring families were kept close to home, as parents suddenly realized how easily their own young ones could disappear into the vast wilderness. By the third day, some of the searchers were beginning to suspect foul play. Rumors began to circulate that perhaps Samuel and Susanna Cox had done something to their own children. It was a terrible accusation, but desperate people sometimes reach for desperate explanations. Some volunteers even searched the Cox property for freshly dug graves, looking for evidence that the parents had harmed their own sons. Samuel Cox, grief-stricken and exhausted, submitted to these suspicions with the patience of a man who knew his innocence and wanted only to find his children. He allowed the searchers to examine every inch of his property, even as his heart broke at the implications of their investigation. In their desperation, the searchers turned to unconventional methods. A dowser was brought in to try to locate the boys using divining rods, but found nothing. A witch from Somerset County was also consulted, and despite claiming to know the children's location, she led a search team through the woods for hours without turning up anything. The failure of these mystical methods only deepened the community's despair and confusion. Meanwhile, the organized search of the forest continued. The volunteers had covered hundreds of acres, following every game trail, checking every cave and overhang, searching along every stream and pond. They had found a few traces that might have belonged to the boys. A broken twig here, a small footprint in the mud there, but nothing that definitively led to the missing children. Days turned into a week, and still there was no sign of George and Joseph Cox. The initial hope that they would be found alive and well had largely disappeared. Now the searchers were looking for bodies, hoping at least to bring some closure to the grieving family and community. It was during this desperate time that a local farmer named Jacob Dibert became involved in the story. Jacob lived about 10 miles away from the Cox family, in a different valley altogether. He was a practical, hard-working man who farmed a small plot of land and kept to himself. He was not particularly religious or given to flights of fancy, but he was a compassionate neighbor who felt deeply sorry for the Cox family's tragedy. As the search entered its second week with no results, Jacob found himself thinking constantly about the missing boys. He had joined some of the search parties when his own work allowed, but like all the other volunteers, he had found nothing. The vastness of the search area was overwhelming. Thousands of acres of dense forest, countless hiding places where two small bodies might never be discovered. One evening, as Jacob sat by his fireplace after a long day of unsuccessful searching, he turned to his wife and made an unusual statement. He said that he wished he could dream of where the boys were located. It was not the kind of thing Jacob typically said. He was a practical man who dealt in facts, not dreams or fancies. But the disappearance of the Cox boys had affected him deeply, and he found himself hoping for any kind of guidance, even from his sleeping mind. That night was May 2nd, 1856, exactly 8 days after George and Joseph Cox had disappeared. Jacob went to sleep with the faces of the missing boys on his mind, and sometime during the dark hours before dawn, he began to dream. In his dream, Jacob found himself walking alone along a path through the forest. The woods in his dream seemed both familiar and strange. They had the feel of the Pennsylvania mountains he knew so well, but the specific landscape was unlike any place he had actually visited. As he walked, he felt a strong sense of purpose, as if he were being guided towards something important. The path led him deeper into the forest, past towering pine trees and through patches of early spring wildflowers. After walking for what seemed like a long time in his dream, Jacob came upon a dead deer lying beside the trail. The animal appeared to have died recently, and something about its presence felt significant, though Jacob couldn't say why. He continued walking past the deer carcass, and soon the path led him to a small stream. The water was running swift and clear, probably fed by snowmelt from higher in the mountains. As Jacob looked for a way to cross, he noticed a fallen tree lying across the stream, specifically a beech tree that formed a natural bridge from one bank to the other. In his dream, Jacob carefully crossed the stream using the fallen beech log, and on the other side, he found a child's shoe. The small shoe was lying on the ground near the water's edge, as if it had been lost by someone trying to cross the stream. Jacob picked up the shoe in his dream and examined it, knowing somehow that it belonged to one of the missing Cox boys. The path continued beyond the stream, leading Jacob into a small ravine. The sides of the ravine were steep, but not dangerously so, and the bottom was filled with a grove of birch trees. Their white bark gleamed in the filtered sunlight that penetrated the forest canopy above. It was a beautiful, peaceful place, but as Jacob walked among the birch trees, he felt a growing sense of sadness and foreboding. And then, near the base of one particular birch tree, Jacob saw them. George and Joseph Cox were lying together on a small rocky outcrop beside a tiny brook that trickled through the ravine. They appeared to be sleeping, curled up together, as if they had lain down to rest and simply never awakened. In his dream, Jacob approached the boys slowly, his heart heavy with the knowledge that he had found them too late. Jacob woke from his dream with a start, his heart pounding, and his mind reeling from the vividness of what he had experienced. The images from the dream remained crystal clear in his memory. The dead deer, the fallen beech log across the stream, the child's shoe, the birch grove, and finally the two boys lying peacefully beneath the trees. His wife noticed his distress and asked what was wrong. Jacob told her about his dream, describing each detail exactly as he had seen it. His wife listened with growing amazement, since Jacob was not a man given to flights of imagination. If he said he had dreamed something, then he had indeed dreamed it, and if the dream had affected him so strongly, then perhaps it meant something. But Jacob was a practical man, and in the daylight, he began to question the significance of his dream. After all, hundreds of people had been searching for the Cox boys for over a week. Professional trackers and experienced woodsmen had covered vast areas of forest without finding any trace of them. What were the chances that a simple farmer could dream their location? That night, May 3rd, Jacob had the same dream again. Every detail was identical: the forest path, the dead deer, the beech log across the stream, the lost shoe, and the birch grove where the boys lay. He woke again with the same powerful feeling that he had been shown something real and important. Still, Jacob hesitated to act on his dream. He was not a superstitious man, and he worried that people would think him foolish or attention-seeking if he claimed to have dreamed the location of the missing boys. The search parties were led by experienced men who knew the mountains well, and Jacob didn't want to waste their time with what might be nothing more than his imagination. On the third night, May 4th, the dream came to Jacob for a third time. Once again, he walked the same forest path, saw the same landmarks, and found the Cox boys in the same peaceful spot beneath the birch trees. This time, however, the dream felt even more urgent and real. When Jacob woke, He was convinced that he had been given knowledge that he was meant to act upon. The next morning, Jacob made a decision that would change his life and bring closure to one of the most mysterious disappearances in Pennsylvania history. He decided to tell someone about his dreams, and naturally he turned to Harrison Wysong, his brother-in-law, who had been actively involved in the search efforts. Harrison was not only Jacob's relative, but also an experienced woodsman who knew the local forest well. As Jacob's brother-in-law, Harrison would be more likely to listen seriously to such an unusual story, and less likely to dismiss Jacob as attention-seeking or foolish. Jacob found Harrison that morning and nervously began to tell him about his 3 nights of identical dreams. As Jacob described the dead deer, the beach log bridge, the lost shoe, and the birch grove, Harrison listened with growing interest. He was familiar with many parts of the local forest, and some of Jacob's descriptions seemed to match places he had seen, though not necessarily in the search areas that had already been covered. What convinced Harrison to take Jacob's dreams seriously was the specific detail and consistency of the descriptions, combined with Jacob's reputation as a sensible, honest man. Harrison agreed to accompany Jacob in searching for the locations described in the dreams. They would look for the specific landmarks. If they found nothing, at least Jacob would have the satisfaction of knowing he had acted on his strange experience. If they did find something, well, that would be a different matter entirely. On May 8th, 14 days after George and Joseph Cox had disappeared, Jacob and Harrison set out into the forest, following the guidance of Jacob's prophetic dreams. They decided to focus their search along Bob's Creek, a waterway that ran through some of the more remote areas of the forest, where the organized search parties had not yet been able to penetrate thoroughly. As they walked deeper into the wilderness, Jacob found himself recognizing certain features of the landscape from his dreams. The feeling was both reassuring and unsettling. They had been searching for several hours when they came upon a dead deer beside what appeared to be an old game trail. Jacob's heart began to beat faster as he recognized the exact scene from his dreams. The deer was lying in precisely the same position he had seen in his sleep, and the surrounding forest looked exactly as he remembered it. Following the trail beyond the deer carcass, they soon heard the sound of running water ahead. As they pushed through the undergrowth, they came to a small stream, and there, exactly as Jacob had dreamed, was a fallen beech tree lying across the water, forming a natural bridge from bank to bank. Harrison looked at Jacob with amazement. The specific details from the dreams were proving accurate, beyond what could be explained by coincidence. They crossed the stream carefully, using the beach log just as Jacob had done in his dreams, and on the far side, they began looking for a child's shoe. They didn't have to look long. There, near the water's edge, was a small shoe that could only have belonged to one of the Cox boys. Jacob picked it up with trembling hands, knowing that they were now very close to the end of their search. Following the path beyond the stream, they soon found themselves descending into a small ravine. The sides were steep but manageable, and at the bottom grew a beautiful grove of birch trees, their white bark gleaming in the dappled sunlight, just as Jacob had seen in his dreams. And there, at the base of a birch tree, near a tiny brook that trickled through the ravine bottom, they found George and Joseph Cox. The 2 brothers were lying together on a small rocky outcrop, curled up, as if they had simply lain down to sleep. They had been dead for some time, probably since shortly after they had first gone missing 2 weeks earlier. There were no signs of violence or animal attack. They appeared to have died of exposure and starvation, clinging to each other for comfort in their final moments. Jacob stood looking down at the peaceful scene, overwhelmed by a mixture of emotions. He felt profound sadness for the boys and their family, relief that they had finally been found, and amazement at the inexplicable power of his dreams. He had walked this exact path 3 times in his sleep before ever setting foot in this remote ravine. Following the path beyond the stream, they soon found themselves descending into a small ravine. The sides were steep but manageable, and at the bottom grew a beautiful grove of birch trees, their white bark gleaming in the dappled sunlight, just as Jacob had seen in his dreams. And there, at the base of a birch tree, near a tiny brook that trickled through the ravine bottom, they found George and Joseph Cox. The two brothers were lying together on a small rocky outcrop, curled up as if they had simply lain down to sleep. They had been dead for some time. There were no signs of violence or animal attack. They appeared to have died of exposure and starvation, clinging to each other for comfort in their final moments. Jacob stood looking down at the peaceful scene, overwhelmed by a mixture of emotions. He felt profound sadness for the boys and their family, relief that they had finally been found, and amazement at the inexplicable power of his dreams. He had walked this exact path 3 times in his sleep before ever setting foot in this remote ravine. Harrison was equally moved by what they had discovered. He had known the Cox boys, and seeing them in their final resting place was heartbreaking, but he was also awed by the circumstances of their discovery. Without Jacob's dreams, this secluded spot might never have been found by the searchers. The two men carefully carried the boys' bodies out of the forest, a sad journey that took several hours due to the difficult terrain. When they emerged from the wilderness and word spread that the Cox boys had been found, the entire community was shocked not only by the tragic confirmation of the children's deaths, but by the extraordinary story of how they had been discovered. News of Jacob's prophetic dreams spread throughout Pennsylvania and beyond. Newspapers picked up the story, and it became one of the most famous cases of apparent supernatural guidance in American history. But the story also attracted skepticism and darker suspicions that have persisted to this day. To many in the community, Jacob became a hero guided by divine providence. They marveled at how a simple farmer could dream such specific details and lead searchers directly to a location that hundreds of experienced woodsmen had been unable to find. The believers pointed to Jacob's reputation as an honest, practical man who had never shown interest in supernatural matters. He was described as intelligent and not superstitious, with no previous faith in omens or dreams. To them, this made his experience all the more miraculous and credible. But others questioned how Jacob could have known exactly where to find the boys if his only guidance truly came from dreams. In an era when suspicion already surrounded the tragedy, evident by the parents themselves, having been suspected of murdering their children for donations, some wondered if Jacob's remarkable success wasn't too convenient to be supernatural. The skeptics asked troubling questions. Had Jacob encountered the boys during their final days and failed to help them? Had he discovered their bodies earlier, but waited to quote-unquote find them in a way that would make him appear heroic rather than negligent? Or, in the darkest theories whispered by some, had Jacob himself played a role in their deaths and used the dream story to deflect suspicion while appearing to be their savior? These doubts were fueled by the seeming impossibility of the story. How could dreams provide such precise, accurate details about a location Jacob claimed never to have visited? The dead deer, the fallen beech log, the lost shoe, the specific ravine with birch trees. The level of detail seemed beyond what supernatural visions typically provided, even to believers in such phenomena. Modern skeptics point out that by the 1850s, the area had been searched extensively. Jacob, as a local farmer who had participated in some search efforts, would have had opportunities to explore parts of the forest. Perhaps he had stumbled upon the boys' bodies during an earlier, unrecorded search and simply created the dream story to explain his knowledge in a way that would make him appear blessed rather than potentially culpable for not reporting his discovery immediately. Others suggest that Jacob might have heard second-hand descriptions of various landmarks from other searchers and unconsciously compiled them into his dreams. The human mind is capable of remarkable feats of synthesis, especially under the emotional pressure of a community tragedy. For his part, Jacob himself never claimed to understand how or why he had dreamed the boy's location. Whether viewed as a supernatural hero or a man with something to hide, he maintained his story consistently throughout his life. He was a practical man who found himself at the center of something that defied practical explanation, or at least, that's how he presented it. He never sought fame or fortune from his experience, and he continued to live quietly on his farm, carrying the mystery of what really happened during those 3 May nights in 1856. The truth, like the boys themselves, remains lost in the Pennsylvania wilderness. We have only Jacob's word about his dreams, and the undeniable fact that he led searchers directly to George and Joseph Cox when no one else had been able to find them. Whether that makes him a man touched by divine vision or a man with earthly knowledge he couldn't openly admit, remains one of the enduring mysteries of the lost children of the Alleghenies. The bodies of George and Joseph Cox were taken home to their grieving parents, and the community came together to provide them with a proper burial. They were laid to rest in Mount Union Cemetery, and their graves became a place where neighbors would come to remember the tragic loss and the mysterious circumstances of their discovery. Samuel and Susanna Cox were finally able to begin the process of grieving and healing, knowing that their boys had been found and given a proper burial. The weeks of uncertainty and searching had been replaced by the sad certainty of their loss, but also by the comfort of knowing their children were at rest. The story of the lost children of the Alleghenies, as George and Joseph Cox came to be known, became part of the folklore of Pennsylvania. Parents would tell the story to their own children as a cautionary tale about the dangers of wandering into the forest alone, but also as a testament to the mysterious ways that love and concern can sometimes transcend the boundaries of the ordinary world. In 1906, 50 years after the tragedy, the community raised money to erect a monument at the site where the boys were found. The fundraising took several years, but in 1910, a granite marker was placed in the birch grove where the boys were found. The monument stands there to this day, deep in the woods of Bedford County, accessible only by a long hike along forest trails. The inscription on the monument reads simply, "Sacred to the memory of George A. Cox, aged 7 years, and Joseph Cox, aged 5 years, sons of Samuel and Susanna Cox, who were lost on nearby mountain, April the 24th, 1856, and found at this spot, May 8th, 1856. The monument doesn't mention Jacob's dreams, but local people still remember that part of the story. Over the years, the story has been retold countless times, each generation adding its own interpretation to the mystery of Jacob's prophetic dreams. Some see it as evidence of divine intervention, others as an example of the power of the human subconscious mind. Still others believe it demonstrates the existence of psychic abilities that science has yet to fully understand. What remains constant in all retellings of the story is the image of those 2 little boys, alone in the vast wilderness, trying to find their way home to their family. They had probably become lost quickly after leaving their cabin, and as the hours and days passed, they would have become increasingly frightened and hungry. The spring nights in the Alleghenies can be cold, and without proper clothing or shelter, exposure would have been their greatest enemy. We can imagine them trying to comfort each other as they wandered deeper into the forest. 7-year-old George trying to be brave for his little brother, 5-year-old Joseph trusting in his older sibling to lead them home. When they finally realized they were truly lost, they probably found the sheltered spot in the birch grove and decided to wait there, hoping that their father would find them. The tiny brook that ran through the ravine would have provided them with fresh water, but there would have been little food available to young children in the early spring forest. They might have tried eating bark or leaves but these would have provided little nutrition. As the days passed, weakness and cold would have gradually overcome them. In their final moments, they turned to each other for comfort, curling up together on the rocky outcrop as they had probably done many times in their bed at home. Death, when it came, would have been peaceful, simply a gradual fading into sleep from which they never awakened. The tragedy of George and Joseph Cox touched the hearts of everyone who heard their story, both in 1856 and in all the years since. They represented every parent's worst fear, the loss of a child to circumstances beyond anyone's control. But their story also represents something else, the power of human compassion and determination, embodied by the hundreds of volunteers who searched tirelessly for two little boys they might not have even known personally. From the day Jacob found the boys to Jacob's eventual passing of old age, Jacob never experienced a psychic dream again. The forest where George and Joseph Cox died has changed over the years. Some of the original trees have fallen and been replaced by new growth. The streams may have changed their courses slightly, and new trails have been worn by deer and hikers. But the basic character of the Allegheny wilderness remains the same: beautiful, peaceful, but potentially dangerous to those who are unprepared or unlucky. The monument to the lost children of the Alleghenies still stands in its remote location, visited each year by hikers and history enthusiasts who make the journey to pay their respects to two little boys who died far from home. Many visitors leave small tokens, flowers, toys, or simply notes expressing their sympathy for a tragedy that occurred more than 150 years ago. As we near the end of this story, let us remember George and Joseph Cox, not just as victims of a wilderness tragedy, but as two little boys who loved their family and tried to help in the only way they knew how. Their father had gone into the forest to find food, and they had followed, probably hoping to help with that important mission. Their intentions were good, even if the results were tragic. The lost children of the Alleghenies reminds us of the preciousness of life and the importance of holding our loved ones close. In our busy modern world, it's easy to take for granted the safety and security that most of us enjoy. The story of George and Joseph Cox reminds us that these blessings should never be taken lightly. As you drift off to sleep tonight, safe and warm in your bed, spare a thought for two little boys who died long ago in a Pennsylvania forest, far from the comfort of home, but not far from the love of a community that never stopped looking for them. Their story has been told for more than a century and a half now, ensuring that George and Joseph Cox will never be truly lost again. Sleep well, and let the memory of this true story from long ago remind you of both the fragility and the resilience of the human spirit. In the dark forest of the Alleghenies, two children found peace at last. They found their way home to the hearts of all who hear their story.